Ever feel like when companies talk about sustainability, they're just blowing smoke?
Yeah.
How can you even tell if they're actually doing enough to fight climate change?
Yeah, it's a valid concern, especially with all these buzzwords, flying around.
Right. Like, how do we even, cut through the noise?
Well, that's where the Science-Based Targets Initiative comes in, or SBTi for short. They're kind of like the referees of corporate climate action.
I like that analogy. So they're the ones setting the standards for what actually counts as progress.
Exactly, yeah. And today we're going to do a deep dive on a really crucial, but honestly often overlooked piece of the puzzle: forests, land, and agriculture.
Which SBTi calls FLAG.
Yep. FLAG. So we're going to be unpacking their FLAG guidance, this new target setting tool they created, and some pretty cutting edge research on how to actually measure real progress in this area.
We've got a stack of insightful documents to go through, right?
We do.
The SBTi FLAG guidance itself, the actual calculator that companies use.
That's the FLAG tool.
The FLAG tool, right? And a research report all about MRV. Measurement, reporting, and verification.
Measurement, reporting, and verification.
Key stuff. Make sure those targets aren't just empty promises.
This isn't just like corporate jargon, is it?
Sure.
These targets have a real impact on the planet, and understanding them gives you the power to hold companies accountable.
Absolutely, yeah. It's about empowering you to make informed choices.
Okay, let's start with the basics. What's so important about FLAG? I mean, I get that forests are important, but how much of an impact can these land use activities really have on climate change?
Well, you might be surprised to learn that agriculture, forestry, and these land use changes are responsible for almost a quarter of global greenhouse gas emissions.
A quarter?
Yeah.
Wow. I had no idea it was that much.
It's huge. And it's not just about cutting those emissions. There's also this massive opportunity to actually remove carbon from the atmosphere.
Like through
things like reforestation and these sustainable farming practices. So it's like a two-pronged approach. Reduce what we're putting out there, and then actually pull some of that existing CO2 back in.
Exactly, yeah. Think about it. Vast reforestation projects, sustainable farming practices that lock carbon into the soil.
What about this silvopasture thing? I saw that mentioned.
Silvopasture. That's where it gets really interesting. So you're combining trees and livestock grazing on the same land, and it actually benefits both the environment and the farmer's bottom line.
Okay, I'm intrigued. So who exactly needs to be setting these FLAG targets?
So the SBTi has made it mandatory for companies in certain FLAG-designated sectors, the ones directly involved in food production, forestry, that sort of thing.
Makes sense. But I'm guessing it goes beyond that, right?
You're right. Any company, no matter what industry, needs to step up if their FLAG-related emissions are more than 20% of their total impact.
That 20% threshold seems key.
It is, yeah. It's designed to catch those companies that might not seem land-intensive on the surface, but actually have a big footprint when you look at their whole supply chain. Think about, I don't know, like a clothing company that's sourcing cotton.
Okay.
Or a furniture retailer dealing with timber.
So even a company that makes T-shirts has to worry about forests.
Exactly. And speaking of forests, SBTi is really serious about deforestation.
Okay.
Companies setting FLAG targets have to publicly commit to zero deforestation by 2025.
No more excuses. I like it. But how do companies actually go about setting these targets? Is there a one-size-fits-all approach?
Not really, no. The SBTi actually offers two distinct pathways: the sector pathway and the commodity pathway.
Okay, break those down for me.
Sure. The sector pathway is for companies that have lots of different land-related activities.
Okay.
And it uses a fixed percentage reduction target, so kind of like a universal benchmark for that whole sector.
So if I'm a company that deals with a bit of everything, the sector pathway is the way to go.
Yeah, most likely. Now, the commodity pathway is much more tailored. It focuses on specific products, things like beef, soy, or timber. And it gets super granular considering the location of production and what's called emissions intensity.
Emissions intensity. Remind me what that is again.
It's basically how much pollution is caused per unit of product. So a kilogram of beef produced in one region might have a very different emissions intensity than a kilogram produced somewhere else, even though it's the same product.
So it's not just about what you produce, but how and where you produce it.
Precisely. And this is where it gets really interesting because the commodity pathway allows companies to factor in carbon removal activities to reach their targets.
You mean companies can actually hit their targets by removing carbon from the atmosphere? I thought that was all about offsets, which don't always have the best reputation.
That's a common misconception. This isn't about buying offsets. It's about genuine changes within their supply chains. Think about reforestation, planting trees on previously degraded land.
Okay, I'm starting to see the potential here.
Yeah, and there's also agroforestry, which we touched on earlier, that clever integration of trees and crops. And then there's the often underestimated power of soil carbon sequestration.
Soil carbon sequestration.
Yes. By using practices like cover cropping and reducing tillage, farmers can enhance the soil's ability to act as a carbon sink, pulling carbon down from the atmosphere and storing it in the ground.
So it's not just about planting trees. There's a whole underground world of carbon storage we can tap into.
Exactly. It's fascinating stuff.
All of this sounds promising, but how do we make sure companies aren't just like cooking the books?
Right.
How do we know these targets are more than just greenwashing?
Well, that's where the MRV report comes in. It highlights this urgent need for clear, standardized ways to track progress. And it emphasizes not just environmental metrics, but financial ones too.
So we can actually see if they're putting their money where their mouth is.
Yes.
Yeah.
Are they actually investing in the changes needed to meet their targets? Do their financial plans back up their environmental promises? The report digs into all of that.
So we can look beyond the PR statements and see what's really happening.
Exactly. And here's the kicker. The report even suggests moving towards third-party assurance, which means independent experts verifying that companies are playing by the rules. No more greenwashing, just real, measurable progress.
That sounds like a big win for transparency and for the planet.
Yeah.
Now, you mentioned these two paths to target setting, the sector and commodity approaches. Let's break those down a little further because I'm still not entirely clear on how they differ in practice.
Sure. So let's start with the sector pathway, which is a bit simpler to grasp. It applies to companies involved in diverse, land-intensive activities, particularly those further down the supply chain. Think food retailers, companies that use agricultural ingredients for things like cosmetics or textiles, even businesses in construction or mining that still have a significant land use footprint.
So the sector pathway casts a pretty wide net.
It does, yeah. And the beauty of it is its simplicity. It uses a fixed percentage reduction target based on the overall potential for emissions reduction in that whole sector. So it's like everyone in that sector is aiming for the same goal using a standardized benchmark.
Got it. So what about the commodity pathway? What kinds of companies would use that approach?
The commodity pathway is primarily designed for companies with significant emissions tied to specific commodities. So things like beef, chicken, dairy, leather, maize, palm oil, pork, rice, soy, wheat, or timberwood fiber.
Wow, that's quite a list. So basically any company dealing with a large volume of those products.
Exactly. And it gets very specific, looking at the emissions intensity of each commodity on a regional basis. This means that the target for, say, beef production in Brazil would be different from the target for beef production in Australia, even though it's the same product.
Because the environmental impact can vary that much depending on location.
Precisely. Emissions intensity can vary significantly depending on things like land management practices, fertilizer use, even the breed of cattle.
So it's not just about what you produce, but how and where you produce it.
You got it. The commodity pathway acknowledges all of that nuance.
Okay, let's get back to those carbon removals for a minute. What specific activities are we talking about here? What are companies actually doing to achieve these removals within their supply chains?
Well, it's a mix of some really innovative practices, both exciting and promising. One of the most significant is reforestation, literally planting trees on land that has been deforested or degraded.
So it's about restoring what's been lost.
Exactly. Reforestation not only helps to absorb CO2 from the atmosphere, but it also helps to restore biodiversity and these vital ecosystem services that forests provide.
What are some other approaches?
Another key area is agroforestry, which we touched upon earlier, that clever integration of trees and crops on the same piece of land.
Yeah.
And that can boost carbon storage, enhance soil health, increase yields for farmers, and even create additional income streams for them, all while sequestering carbon.
That sounds like a win-win situation.
It really can be. And then there's the often underestimated power of soil carbon sequestration. By using practices like cover cropping, reducing tillage, and implementing crop rotation, farmers can significantly enhance the ability of soils to act as a carbon sink.
So it's about working with nature, not against it.
Precisely. These methods are all about moving beyond simply reducing emissions to actively restoring and enhancing the natural systems that can help us combat climate change.
Now, how does the no deforestation commitment fit into all of this? Is it simply a requirement or does it go deeper than that?
It's a non-negotiable foundation. Companies setting FLAG targets are required to publicly commit to achieving zero deforestation by 2025.
So it's like a prerequisite for even entering the game.
You could say that it's a critical first step towards responsible land use. It's acknowledging that deforestation is a major contributor to climate change and that we need to protect these vital ecosystems.
Okay, no deforestation is a must. But what about other types of land conversion, like converting natural ecosystems to plantations or draining peatlands? Are those addressed too?
That's a great question, and that's where things get a bit more complex. The current FLAG pathways primarily focus on deforestation, but the SBTi recognizes the importance of addressing all forms of land conversion.
So the focus on deforestation is like a starting point with the understanding that more needs to be done.
Exactly. The challenge lies in gathering accurate data to track and quantify emissions from these other activities. It's a work in progress, but the commitment to addressing these issues is certainly there.
So there's more to come on that front. That makes sense. Now, you mentioned that the SBTi requires companies to commit to no deforestation, but they also recommend aligning with the Accountability Framework Initiative, or AFI.
Yeah.
What is the AFI all about, and why this added layer of alignment?
Think of the AFI as the gold standard for responsible land use. It goes beyond simply avoiding deforestation to encompass a broader set of principles and criteria for sustainable production.
So it's taking a more holistic view.
Precisely. It's about ensuring that land use decisions are socially and environmentally responsible, respecting the rights of indigenous peoples and local communities, and promoting biodiversity conservation.
So aligning with the AFI isn't mandatory for setting SBTi FLAG targets, but is highly encouraged.
Yes. It demonstrates a deeper level of commitment to responsible land use and sends a strong signal to stakeholders that a company is truly serious about sustainability.
It's like they're going above and beyond to prove they're walking the walk.
Exactly.
Now, this is all pretty technical stuff. Let's bring it back to our listener.
Yeah.
Why should you care about these SBTi FLAG targets, all this talk about carbon removals and no deforestation? What does it actually mean for you in your everyday life?
It boils down to having the power to make more informed choices. Understanding these targets and the science behind them allows you to critically assess a company's sustainability claims.
Right.
Are they just greenwashing, or are they genuinely committed to reducing their impact on the planet?
So it's about cutting through the marketing hype and seeing what's real.
Exactly. And it also empowers you to support those businesses that are truly making a difference. Look for products and brands that are aligned with the SBTi FLAG guidance. Choose companies that are transparent about their supply chains and their efforts to reduce deforestation.
So it's about using our purchasing power to drive positive change.
Precisely. Your choices as a consumer can have a ripple effect throughout the market, encouraging more businesses to step up and prioritize sustainability.
Love that idea. But it's not just about individual choices, right?
Right. The success of these initiatives hinges on collective action. So engage in conversations about these issues, spread awareness, and advocate for policies that support sustainable land use and carbon removal strategies.
It's a reminder that we all have a role to play in creating a more sustainable future. Now, let's shift gears and talk about how we actually measure progress towards these targets. Setting targets is one thing, but ensuring they're met is a whole other challenge.
You're absolutely right. What's the point of all these commitments if we can't track whether companies are actually making progress? That's where that MRV research report comes in. It provides valuable insights into how to measure, report, and verify progress on those science-based targets.
Okay, let's dive into those MRV findings. What are the key takeaways?
Well, one of the most significant points the report highlights is the need to go beyond simply tracking emissions reductions. It suggests incorporating additional progress indicators that give us a more holistic view of a company's decarbonization efforts.
Give me an example.
Sure. One example would be financial metrics like capital expenditure, or CapEx, and operational expenditure, or OpEx. Looking at these can reveal whether companies are putting their money where their mouth is.
So we can see if they're actually investing in the changes needed to meet their targets.
Exactly. The report also emphasizes the importance of transition plans, detailed, actionable roadmaps for how companies plan to achieve their targets. And these plans should be publicly available so stakeholders can assess their credibility and hold those companies accountable.
Makes sense. A plan without action is just a wish list.
Precisely. And another crucial element highlighted in the report is the need for third-party assurance.
Right.
That means having independent experts verify the accuracy and completeness of a company's reported data.
So it's like having a referee to make sure everyone's playing by the rules.
Exactly. Third-party assurance helps mitigate the risk of greenwashing and instills greater confidence in those corporate sustainability claims.
This all sounds incredibly promising. But are there any challenges in implementing these MRV recommendations?
Of course, there are always hurdles. One primary challenge is standardizing reporting practices. There's a lack of consistency in how companies currently disclose information, making it hard to compare progress across different organizations.
Do we need a common language for measuring progress?
Exactly. Another challenge lies in data availability and quality. Not all companies have easy access to the necessary data, particularly when it comes to their supply chains.
And even when data is available, there's always the question of accuracy and completeness.
You're spot on. Addressing these data challenges requires investments in data collection, management, and verification systems, which can be a significant undertaking for many companies.
I'm seeing how complex this can all get. But despite these challenges, it's clear that robust MRV is essential for making sure these science-based targets actually work.
Absolutely. Without proper measurement, reporting, and verification, these targets risk becoming nothing more than aspirations, lacking the accountability needed to drive real change.
Well said. Now, let's dive into the SBTi FLAG guidance itself. It outlines the criteria and recommendations for companies setting targets for their land use emissions and removals. Can you walk us through some of the key elements of this guidance?
Certainly. One of the first things the guidance clarifies is which companies are actually required to set these FLAG targets. As we discussed, it's mandatory for companies in those FLAG-designated sectors like food and beverage processing, forestry, and so on.
That seems straightforward enough.
It is. But it also applies to companies in any other sector if their FLAG-related emissions are more than 20% of their total emissions across scopes 1, 2, and 3.
Right.
This 20% threshold is crucial. It's that wider net we mentioned, designed to catch companies whose impact on land use might not be immediately obvious.
Like our t-shirt company from earlier.
Exactly. Now, the guidance also outlines specific criteria for accounting for land-related emissions and removals.
What sorts of things are we talking about?
Well, it includes emissions from land use change, which refers to the conversion of land from one use to another, things like deforestation for agriculture or the draining of peatlands. So they're not just looking at ongoing emissions, but also at the historical impact of land conversion.
Okay, so they're taking a long view of how land has been used and its cumulative impact.
Exactly. They also consider emissions from land management practices that covers things like fertilizer use, livestock management, and tillage practices.
So it's not just about what land is used for, but also how it's managed.
Precisely. And of course, the guidance also addresses the accounting for carbon removals, which, as we've discussed, are going to play a crucial role in achieving those ambitious climate targets.
Now, does the guidance get into specifics about how companies should calculate these emissions and removals? Are there certain accounting methods they need to use?
Yes, it does. It emphasizes aligning with established standards like the GHG Protocol, which provides a globally recognized framework for corporate greenhouse gas accounting.
So there's a solid foundation for ensuring consistency and accuracy in the data.
Exactly. The guidance also goes into detail about those two target-setting approaches we've discussed: the sector approach and the commodity approach.
Right, the sector approach for companies with a broad range of activities, and the commodity approach for those focused on specific products.
You got it. And importantly, the guidance also addresses target validation and reporting, ensuring that companies are not just setting targets in isolation, but are also transparently tracking and reporting their progress towards those goals.
So it's about accountability and making sure these targets are actually driving real-world change.
Absolutely.
This is all starting to give me a much clearer picture of how this SBTi FLAG guidance is shaping corporate action on land use and climate change. Now, can you tell us a bit about how the FLAG tool itself actually works in practice?
The FLAG tool is essentially a calculator that helps companies determine their science-based targets for those land-related emissions and removals. It takes all that complex science and data from the SBTi guidance and translates it into a user-friendly format.
So it's like a bridge between the theory and the practical application.
That's a great way to put it. The tool allows companies to input data about their operations, their supply chains, and their planned activities, and then it crunches the numbers and calculates the specific emissions reductions and removals needed to align with a 1.5 degrees Celsius pathway.
Wow, that sounds incredibly helpful. Is it just about crunching numbers, though?
Not at all. The tool also provides guidance and resources to help companies understand the methodologies, the assumptions behind the calculations, and the implications of their choices.
So it's like having a built-in expert to guide them through the process.
Exactly. The FLAG tool really empowers companies to take ownership of their climate impact, providing a clear path towards setting ambitious, science-based targets.
All of this is incredibly interesting, but I can't help but wonder if there's a potential for companies to get so lost in the technical weeds of setting targets and crunching numbers that they lose sight of the bigger picture. How do we ensure that these targets are actually driving meaningful change on the ground and not just becoming a box-ticking exercise?
That is a crucial point. Setting targets is a necessary first step, but it's certainly not enough on its own. Companies need to integrate these targets into their broader sustainability strategies. They need to be aligning their business models, their supply chains, and their investments with the goals of a low-carbon, climate-resilient future.
So it's about going beyond compliance and truly embedding sustainability into the very core of their operations.
You got it. It's about a real shift in mindset, moving beyond a compliance-driven approach and embracing sustainability as a core business principle. And it's also about recognizing that addressing climate change through land use goes hand in hand with those other critical sustainability goals, like biodiversity conservation, water stewardship, and social equity.
It's all interconnected. We can't solve one problem in isolation.
Exactly. And ultimately, the success of these initiatives depends on a collaborative effort between businesses, governments, civil society, and of course, consumers all working together to create a more sustainable future.
Well said. It's a reminder that we all have a role to play. Now, I'm curious to hear more about your thoughts on the future of science-based targets, especially when it comes to this whole world of FLAG. What are some of the emerging trends and challenges you see on the horizon?
It's definitely a dynamic and evolving landscape. One of the most exciting trends I see is the growing recognition of the interconnectedness between climate change, nature, and social equity. The SBTi FLAG guidance is a prime example of this. It's pushing companies to think about the broader impacts of their land use decisions, not just on emissions, but also on things like biodiversity, water resources, and the livelihoods of local communities.
So it's moving towards a more holistic approach to sustainability.
Exactly. And I think this trend is only going to accelerate in the coming years as the urgency of addressing these interconnected challenges becomes increasingly apparent.
Now, what about challenges? What are some of the hurdles you see on the horizon for science-based targets?
One of the biggest challenges lies in scaling up these initiatives to bring in a wider range of companies and sectors. Currently, the companies that have adopted science-based targets are mostly larger corporations, particularly in developed countries.
So how do we change that? How do we bring more players into the game?
That's the key question. We need to find ways to engage smaller businesses, those operating in emerging markets, and those in sectors that may not have traditionally thought much about their land use footprint.
So it's about democratizing access to these tools and resources, making them accessible to a wider range of companies, regardless of their size or location.
Precisely. And another challenge is bridging the gap between setting those targets and actually implementing them. There's a real risk of companies getting so caught up in the technicalities of accounting and reporting that they forget to actually make the necessary changes on the ground.
So it's one thing to talk the talk, but it's another to actually walk the walk.
Exactly. And that requires a compliance-driven approach and truly embracing sustainability as a core business principle.
Well said. Now, I want to go back to that 20% threshold for a FLAG-related emissions for a moment. Can you tell us a bit more about why that specific number is so important?
Yeah, it's a key element of the SBTi FLAG guidance. And it's carefully designed to ensure that companies with a significant land use footprint are held accountable for their impacts. The 20% threshold is based on gross emissions, so that means it doesn't include any carbon removals. That prevents companies from just offsetting their emissions through things like, carbon sequestration projects without actually addressing those root causes of their impact.
So it's about tackling the problem at its source, not just trying to compensate for it.
Exactly. And it's worth noting that the 20% threshold applies to a company's total emissions across scopes 1, 2, and 3. This means it considers not just emissions from their own operations, but also emissions from their purchased energy and their entire value chain.
So it's a really comprehensive picture of their impact.
It is, yeah. And it helps to capture companies that might not seem like obvious candidates for FLAG target setting. Remember that clothing retailer. Their direct operations might not involve significant land use, but their supply chain, which includes things like cotton production or leather sourcing, could have a substantial land use footprint.
So if those emissions from their supply chain exceed 20% of their total emissions, they'd be required to set FLAG targets.
Exactly. It's about recognizing that even companies that don't directly engage in land-intensive activities can still have a huge impact through their supply chains. This 20% threshold helps to level the playing field, making sure companies across all sectors are held accountable for their contributions to those land use-related emissions.
It's a smart way to make sure everyone is pulling their weight, even those companies whose impacts might be a bit hidden.
I agree.
Now, you've mentioned separating FLAG emissions from non-FLAG emissions a few times. Can you elaborate a bit more on why that distinction is so important?
Yeah, it's crucial for a couple of key reasons. First, separating those FLAG and non-FLAG emissions allows for a more accurate and targeted assessment of a company's impact on land use. By isolating FLAG emissions, we can better understand where those emissions are coming from and develop more effective strategies to reduce them.
So it's about getting specific with the data and targeting solutions where they're needed most.
Precisely. Second, separating those emissions is important because it helps to avoid double counting. If a company were to include both a FLAG and non-FLAG emissions in the same target, they could potentially achieve their target by reducing emissions in one area while neglecting the other.
So it's a way of making sure they're making progress on all fronts, not just shifting things around to make the numbers look good.
Exactly. By keeping those emissions separate, we can track progress in both areas and make sure companies are making comprehensive efforts to reduce their overall climate impact.
Okay, that makes a lot of sense. Now let's talk about the SBTi's decision to require that public commitment to no deforestation. Can you give us a little more insight into their rationale for making that a non-negotiable element of the FLAG guidance?
Well, the SBTi's no deforestation commitment is like a cornerstone of their FLAG guidance, and it reflects just how critical forests are in mitigating climate change. Deforestation is a major contributor to those global greenhouse gas emissions, accounting for roughly 12% of global emissions, and a staggering 50% of emissions from the AFLU sector, that's agriculture, forestry, and other land use.
Wow, those are huge numbers. So it's not just about protecting forests for their own sake, but for their role in regulating our climate.
Exactly. And the SBTi recognizes that halting deforestation is essential if we're going to achieve the goals of the Paris Agreement. This commitment goes beyond simply reducing emissions from deforestation. It's also about protecting these vital ecosystems and the invaluable services they provide.
So it's acknowledging the multifaceted value of forests, from biodiversity to livelihoods.
You got it. And by requiring companies to make this public commitment, the SBTi is sending a clear signal to the market that deforestation is no longer acceptable.
No more excuses. I love it. It's about raising the bar for corporate responsibility and pushing for a real shift towards sustainable land use.
I agree. It's a powerful statement.
Now let's revisit the SBTi's recommendation that companies align their no deforestation commitments with the Accountability Framework Initiative, or AFI. Can you remind us what the AFI is all about and why aligning with it is so beneficial for companies?
The AFI provides a set of principles, definitions, and guidelines to help companies develop and implement policies and practices that protect forests and other natural ecosystems. It's a robust framework that goes beyond simply avoiding deforestation to encompass those broader sustainability considerations we talked about earlier.
So it's like a holistic approach to land use, taking into account those social and environmental factors.
Exactly. While the SBTi doesn't require AFI alignment, they strongly encourage it because it demonstrates a deeper level of commitment to responsible land use.
So it's a way for companies to go above and beyond and demonstrate their commitment to sustainability.
Precisely. The AFI provides a clear pathway for companies to move beyond just making commitments to actually implementing those commitments in a credible and verifiable way.
It's a powerful way to back up their words with concrete actions.
I agree. It adds a lot of weight to those commitments.
Now, one of the most interesting parts of this whole discussion for me has been the emphasis on maximizing carbon removals. Can you talk a bit more about the different types of removal activities that companies are using and incorporating into their strategies?
Absolutely. As we discussed earlier, one of the most common activities is reforestation, planting trees on land that has been deforested or degraded.
So it's about repairing the damage that's been done and rebuilding those vital carbon sinks.
Exactly. Reforestation not only helps to sequester carbon from the atmosphere, but it also helps to restore biodiversity, improve soil health, and create a range of other benefits for the environment and for local communities.
And what are some other approaches?
Another important area is agroforestry, which involves integrating trees and crops on the same piece of land. Agroforestry can enhance soil health, increase yields for farmers, and provide additional income streams for them, all while sequestering carbon.
So it's about working with nature, not against it.
Precisely. Agroforestry is a really clever way to combine agricultural production with environmental stewardship.
I love that. Now, we've also touched upon the potential of soil carbon sequestration. Can you remind us what that is and why it's so important in this context?
Of course. By implementing practices like cover cropping, reducing tillage, and using crop rotation, farmers can enhance the soil's ability to act as a massive carbon sink, drawing carbon down from the atmosphere and storing it underground.
So it's like unlocking this hidden world of carbon storage beneath our feet.
Exactly. It's an incredibly powerful tool that often gets overlooked.
These are all fantastic examples of how companies can go beyond simply reducing their emissions and actually contribute to drawing down carbon from the atmosphere.
Yeah,
It's really inspiring to see this kind of innovation happening.
I agree. It's a hopeful sign that we can turn things around.
Now, when it comes to incorporating removals into their targets, what are some of the challenges that companies face? Is it as simple as planting some trees and calling it a day?
Not quite. One of the biggest challenges is ensuring that those removals are permanent and verifiable. We need to be certain that the carbon sequestered in these projects is locked away for the long term, not just temporarily stored.
So how do we make sure that happens?
It requires careful planning, robust monitoring, and a long-term commitment. Companies need to choose projects that are designed for long-term carbon sequestration. They need to implement measures to prevent leakage, which we talked about earlier, and they need to establish systems for ongoing monitoring and verification.
So it's not a one-time effort. It requires ongoing attention and management to ensure the long-term success of those projects.
Absolutely. And I think it's also really important for companies and for everyone really to recognize that carbon removals are not a silver bullet for solving climate change. They're a very important part of the solution, but they shouldn't be seen as a replacement for reducing emissions at the source.
So it's a both-hand situation.
Yeah.
We need to reduce what we're emitting and find ways to remove what's already out there.
Exactly. It's about striking that balance between mitigation and sequestration. One doesn't replace the other.
I think that's a crucial message for businesses and consumers alike. We can't just rely on planting trees to solve the problem. We have to change our behaviors and reduce our emissions as well.
I agree. Now, you mentioned leakage earlier, and I'm curious to hear a little more about that. Can you explain why it's such a concern and give us an example of how it might play out in the real world?
Yeah. Leakage is one of those tricky concepts that's really important to understand when we're talking about carbon removals. It refers to the unintended consequences of these projects, where actions taken in one place might shift the problem to another location without actually solving it.
So like you squeeze a balloon, you push in one place, and it bulges out somewhere else. That's a great analogy. Addressing leakage requires a much more holistic and systems thinking approach. We have to think about the interconnectedness of land use and the potential for those displacement effects.
So how do companies go about mitigating the risk of leakage? What steps can they take to make sure their projects are truly beneficial and not just displacing the problem?
It starts with careful project selection. Companies need to invest in projects that are designed from the ground up to avoid leakage and minimize those displacement effects. That often means working closely with local communities and ensuring that those communities benefit from the project as well.
So it's not just about planting trees, it's about understanding the social and economic dynamics of the region and ensuring that those are factored into the project design.
Exactly. It's about seeing the bigger picture, recognizing that these projects are not just about environmental outcomes, but also about social and economic impacts as well.
It's about creating a more sustainable and equitable system for everyone. Now, you've also mentioned the importance of robust monitoring to track these projects and ensure their long-term success. Can you elaborate on that a bit more? What kinds of monitoring are we talking about, and what role does technology play in all of this?
Monitoring is absolutely crucial for ensuring that carbon removal projects are delivering the promised benefits. We need to track things like tree growth, soil carbon levels, and land use changes over time, to make sure that the carbon is actually being sequestered and that it's staying locked away.
So how do we track all of that?
Well, technology is playing an increasingly important role. We have remote sensing techniques like satellite imagery and LiDAR, which allow us to monitor vast areas of land and track those changes in vegetation cover and other key indicators.
So we can actually see from space what's happening on the ground.
We can, and we can also use ground-based sensors to collect data on things like soil carbon, tree growth, and water levels. And then all of that data can be fed into these sophisticated models that help us estimate carbon sequestration, identify potential problems, and make more informed management decisions.
So technologies is giving us a much more comprehensive and nuanced view of these complex ecosystems and how they're changing over time.
It really is, yeah. It's helping us to move beyond those rough estimates and get a much more precise and accurate picture of what's happening on the ground.
Now, you've also spoken about the importance of financial metrics in assessing a company's true commitment to sustainability. Can you elaborate on that a bit more? What can we learn from looking at a company's finances that we might not see from their public statements or marketing campaigns?
Yeah, financial metrics can be incredibly revealing when it comes to sustainability. They often provide a much clearer picture of a company's priorities than their public statements. Actions speak louder than words, as they say, and financial decisions reveal where a company is truly focusing its resources.
So it's about looking beyond the rhetoric and seeing where their money is actually going.
Exactly. For example, if a company claims to be committed to reducing emissions, but then doesn't invest in things like renewable energy, energy efficiency, or sustainable supply chains, it kind of raises a red flag.
It suggests that sustainability might not be as high on their list of priorities as they claim.
Right. Examining their financial decisions can help us cut through the greenwashing and get a better sense of their true commitment.
So what are some of the specific financial metrics that can give us insight into a company's sustainability performance?
One of the most important is capital expenditure, or CapEx. This refers to investments in long-term assets like buildings, equipment, and infrastructure. Analyzing a company's CapEx can tell us whether they're putting their money where their mouth is when it comes to sustainability.
So are they investing in those solar farms, upgrading their facilities to be more energy efficient, or building more sustainable supply chains?
Exactly. Those are the types of investments that will drive real progress toward their science-based targets. Another key metric is operational expenditure, or OPEX, which refers to the ongoing costs of running a business, including things like energy bills, waste disposal, and transportation.
So by looking at OPEX, we can see if a company is taking concrete steps to reduce its day-to-day environmental impact.
Precisely. Are they reducing energy consumption, minimizing waste, or optimizing their logistics to shrink their carbon footprint? These operational decisions have a big impact on their overall sustainability performance.
And the final financial metric you mentioned was research and development spending.
Right. This one's particularly interesting because it shows us if a company is truly investing in innovation and looking for new solutions to those challenges of sustainability. Are they developing new technologies, processes, or products that can help to create a more sustainable future?
So it's about looking beyond their current practices and seeing if they're investing in the future of sustainability.
Exactly. It signals a long-term commitment to finding solutions and pushing the boundaries of what's possible. By analyzing these financial metrics, so CapEx, OpEx, and R&D spending, we can gain a much more holistic understanding of a company's approach to sustainability. Are they just making superficial changes, or are they fundamentally shifting their business model to prioritize a sustainable future?
It's like peeking behind the curtain to see what's really driving their actions.
I like that analogy. It's about going beyond those surface-level claims and really understanding what's going on behind the scenes.
Now, I'm curious to hear your thoughts on the evolving landscape of science-based targets in general. We've talked a lot about FLAG, but what are some of the broader trends and challenges you see emerging as more and more companies set these ambitious goals?
It's a really exciting time to be working in this field. One of the most promising trends I've observed is the growing integration of nature-based solutions into corporate climate strategies. Companies are finally beginning to recognize the vital role that ecosystems play in mitigating climate change, and they're starting to incorporate strategies like, reforestation, agroforestry, and soil carbon sequestration into their targets.
So it's about recognizing the power of nature and working with natural systems rather than trying to engineer our way out of the problem.
Exactly. And this shift is being driven by a growing body of scientific evidence, demonstrating the effectiveness and the multiple benefits of those nature-based solutions.
It's not just about reducing carbon. It's about creating a healthier and more resilient planet overall.
Absolutely. Now, alongside these positive trends, we're also seeing some persistent challenges.
Okay.
One of the biggest hurdles on the horizon is addressing Scope 3 emissions. These are the emissions that occur throughout a company's value chain, everything from their suppliers to their customers.
So it's about expanding that circle of responsibility beyond a company's own direct operations.
Precisely. Scope 3 emissions can be the largest part of a company's carbon footprint, and addressing them effectively requires collaboration and coordination across that entire value chain.
That sounds like a tall order.
It is, yeah. It involves working with suppliers to reduce their emissions, engaging with customers to promote sustainable consumption, and even redesigning products and services to be more sustainable throughout their entire life cycle.
So how is the SBTi working to address this complex challenge of Scope 3 emissions? It seems like it would require a pretty major shift in how companies operate.
They're developing guidance and methodologies specifically designed to help companies account for and reduce their Scope 3 emissions. And they're encouraging collaboration between companies, recognizing that no single company can solve this problem alone. It requires a collective effort to make real progress.
That makes a lot of sense. It's about working together to create a more sustainable system, rather than trying to go it alone.
Exactly. And another significant challenge is scaling up the adoption of science-based targets, particularly among smaller businesses and those operating in emerging markets. We've talked about how larger corporations in developed countries are leading the charge, but we need to find ways to engage a much broader range of companies if we're going to make a real dent in those global emissions.
What are some of the barriers that these smaller companies face when it comes to adopting these targets?
It's often a matter of resources, expertise, and capacity. Many smaller businesses and those in developing countries simply don't have the staff, the data, or the financial resources to navigate the complexities of science-based target setting.
So it's about making those tools and resources more accessible and user-friendly, especially for companies that might not have the same level of support as those larger corporations.
Precisely. We need to provide tailored guidance, simplified methodologies, and capacity-building support to empower these businesses to take action on climate change.
It's about leveling the playing field and ensuring that sustainability is within reach for businesses of all sizes, regardless of their location.
Precisely. And I think another crucial element is raising awareness and understanding of what science-based targets actually are and why they're so important.
So it's about education and outreach, spreading the word, and demonstrating the value of these initiatives.
Absolutely. We need to show businesses how setting science-based targets can benefit not just the planet, but their own bottom line as well. It's not just about altruism, it's about good business sense.
Right. It's about recognizing that sustainability is not just a cost, but also an opportunity to innovate, improve efficiency, and gain a competitive advantage.
Exactly. And that message is starting to resonate with more and more companies around the world.
Now, we've talked a lot about companies and investors, but what role can consumers play in all of this? How can we, as individuals, support this transition to a more sustainable future, especially when it comes to those complexities of land use and carbon removals?
Consumers have an incredibly important role to play. They have the power to influence corporate practices and government policies through their choices and their voices. It's about recognizing that we're not just passive consumers, but active participants in shaping the future of our planet.
I love that framing. So what are some practical steps that consumers can take to make a difference?
One of the most powerful things consumers can do is use their purchasing power to support businesses that are taking real action on climate change. They can choose products from companies that have set science-based targets, that are transparent about their supply chains, and that are actively working to reduce their impact on the environment.
So it's about voting with our wallets and supporting the companies that are aligning with our values.
Exactly. Consumer demand can be a powerful driver of change, and companies are paying attention to what consumers are asking for.
So we're not powerless in this. We can make a difference through our everyday choices.
Absolutely. And beyond those purchasing decisions, consumers can also raise their voices and advocate for stronger climate policies.
Right.
They can contact their elected officials, support organizations that are working to protect the environment, and engage in conversations about these issues with their friends, their families, their communities.
It's about recognizing that we all have a role to play in creating a more sustainable future, whether it's through our individual choices, our advocacy efforts, or simply raising awareness and having these conversations.
I couldn't agree more. Collective action is key, and it starts with each of us making a commitment to do what we can.
Now let's talk about the role of governments in all of this. We've focused on the corporate world and the role of consumers, But what about policymakers? What can governments do to create a policy environment that supports sustainable land use and accelerates climate action?
Governments have a huge role to play. They can establish legal frameworks, provide financial incentives, and invest in research and development to create a more supportive environment for those sustainable practices. They can set the stage for businesses and consumers to thrive in a low-carbon, climate-resilient world.
So it's about using the power of policy to drive positive change.
Exactly. There are so many policy levers that governments can pull. They can implement carbon pricing mechanisms that put a price on carbon emissions, incentivize businesses to reduce their impact.
So it's about making pollution more expensive and conservation more profitable.
Precisely. And they can implement regulations that promote sustainable forest management, reduce deforestation, and protect biodiversity. These regulations provide clear guidelines for businesses and help to ensure that land use is managed responsibly.
It creates a level playing field and ensures that everyone is operating under the same rules.
Exactly. And beyond regulations, governments can also provide financial incentives for farmers to adopt sustainable agricultural practices, things like cover cropping, reduced tillage, and crop rotation. These incentives help to reduce the financial burden on farmers and make it easier for them to transition to more sustainable methods.
It's about providing support and resources to make these transitions easier.
Exactly. And governments can also play a vital role in raising consumer awareness and encouraging more sustainable consumption patterns. They can do this through public education campaigns, labeling programs, and other initiatives that help consumers make more informed choices.
So it's about empowering consumers with information and giving them the tools they need to make sustainable choices.
Precisely. Governments have a huge range of tools at their disposal to support sustainable land use and climate action, and it's encouraging to see more and more governments stepping up to the challenge.
I think it's becoming increasingly clear that climate change is not just an environmental issue, but also an economic issue, a social issue, and a political issue. It's something that requires action at every level of society.
I completely agree. It's a multifaceted challenge that requires a multifaceted response.
And one of the things that strikes me as incredibly important in all of this is the need for international cooperation. Climate change and land use are not confined by national borders. They're global challenges that require global solutions.
You're absolutely right. No single country can solve these problems on its own. It requires collaboration, knowledge sharing, and a collective commitment to finding solutions that work for everyone.
So how can we strengthen international cooperation in this area? What are some of the key mechanisms and strategies?
Well, it involves strengthening international agreements like the Paris Agreement, which provides a framework for global action on climate change.
Right.
It also means providing financial and technical support to developing countries to help them transition to a low-carbon and climate-resilient future.
So it's about sharing responsibility and supporting those who are most vulnerable to the impacts of climate change.
Exactly. And it's also about recognizing that we're all in this together. The fate of our planet depends on our ability to work together and find solutions that benefit everyone.
Now, another piece of the puzzle that's crucial to all of this is finance. We've talked about the financial decisions that companies are making and the role of governments in providing incentives. But what about the broader financial system? How can we shift the flow of capital away from unsustainable activities and towards investments that support a more sustainable future?
That's a crucial question. We need to fundamentally redirect financial flows away from things like fossil fuel extraction and deforestation and towards things like renewable energy, sustainable agriculture, and nature-based solutions.
It's about making sustainability the smart financial choice.
Exactly. And thankfully, we're starting to see a shift in that direction. Investors are becoming increasingly aware of the risks associated with climate change and the immense opportunities presented by a transition to a low-carbon economy.
So how can we accelerate that shift? How do we make sustainability the go-to option for investors?
It involves a multi-pronged approach. Governments can implement clear and consistent policies that provide a stable and predictable environment for those sustainable investments.
So it's about creating a regulatory framework that rewards sustainable practices and discourages unsustainable ones.
Precisely. And we also need to establish robust reporting frameworks that allow investors to assess the sustainability performance of companies and make informed investment decisions.
Transparency is key.
It is. And finally, we need to develop innovative financial instruments that can de-risk those sustainable investments and attract private capital. This could involve things like green bonds, sustainability-linked loans, and other financial products that are specifically designed to support sustainable projects and initiatives.
So it's about making it easier and more attractive for investors to put their money into projects that are good for the planet.
Exactly. It's about creating a financial system that rewards sustainability and helps to accelerate the transition to a low-carbon, climate-resilient future.
Now, we've been talking a lot about tangible things like trees and emissions, but I'd love to delve a bit deeper into the concept of ecosystem services and the challenges of valuing the full range of benefits that nature provides. It's a topic that I find fascinating, but it's also one that seems incredibly complex.
I agree. It's a fascinating but often overlooked aspect of sustainability. Ecosystem services encompass all of those amazing benefits that nature provides to humans, from clean air and water to pollination and climate regulation.
It's about recognizing that nature is not just something nice to have, but something essential for our well-being and survival.
Exactly. We depend on these ecosystem services for our very existence, yet many of them are difficult to quantify and don't have an easily assigned market price. This makes it challenging to incorporate their value into traditional economic accounting systems.
It's like trying to put a price tag on something that's priceless.
You could say that, but finding ways to value these ecosystem services is crucial for making informed decisions about land use and designing policies that protect those vital natural systems. If we don't understand the value of what we're losing, we're less likely to take the necessary steps to protect it.
Okay, so how do we go about valuing these intangible benefits? How do we make the invisible visible?
It involves a combination of creative economic valuation techniques, rigorous scientific methodologies, and meaningful engagement with stakeholders who depend on these ecosystems.
Can you give us some examples of how that might work in practice?
Absolutely. One way to estimate the value of, let's say, clean water provided by a forest is to calculate the cost of treating water that's been contaminated due to deforestation. Similarly, we can estimate the value of pollination services provided by bees by looking at the impact of declining bee populations on those crop yields. And we can use carbon pricing models to estimate the economic value of carbon sequestration provided by forests and other natural ecosystems.
So it's about finding ways to make those connections between the health of our ecosystems and our own well-being, both in terms of our health and our economic prosperity.
Exactly. It's about recognizing that nature is not just something separate from us, it's the foundation of our very existence.
Now, while putting a price tag on these services can be helpful for making those connections clear, it also feels somewhat inadequate. It's like saying that the value of a beautiful sunset can be measured by the number of tourists it attracts. It misses something deeper, doesn't it?
You're absolutely right. While economic valuation can be a helpful tool for decision-making, it's important to acknowledge that the value of those ecosystem services extends far beyond their economic worth. These natural systems have intrinsic value, cultural significance, and spiritual importance to many communities around the world.
Right.
They're part of our heritage, our identity, and our connection to the planet.
And those values are much harder to quantify, but they're no less important.
Exactly. So while economic valuation can help us to make more informed decisions, it's essential to remember that it's only part of the story. Protecting and restoring these ecosystems is not just about maximizing economic benefits, it's about respecting their intrinsic value and ensuring that future generations can enjoy the same benefits that we do.
I love that. It's about recognizing that we're part of something much larger than ourselves, and that our well-being is inextricably linked to the health of our planet.
I couldn't agree more. Now, as we continue this conversation, I want to shift gears and talk about the crucial role of education and awareness raising in driving the transition to a more sustainable future. It's a theme that's woven throughout everything we've discussed, but I think it deserves some dedicated attention. We've talked about the need for businesses to change, for governments to implement policies, and for consumers to make different choices, but all of that requires a foundation of knowledge and understanding.
I completely agree. We can't expect people to act if they don't understand the issue or the solutions that are available. So how do we go about building that foundation of knowledge and inspiring people to take action?
There are so many different avenues we can explore. Formal education is crucial. We need to be teaching young people about the science of climate change, the impacts on our planet and our communities, and the solutions that are available. And it's not just about science, it's about fostering critical thinking, problem solving, and a sense of agency, empowering them to become change makers.
It's about giving them the knowledge and the tools to create a better future.
Exactly. And beyond formal education, there's a huge role for public awareness campaigns, media engagement, and community outreach. We need to be telling stories, sharing information, and making these issues relevant to people's everyday lives.
It's about meeting people where they are and connecting with them on an emotional level. Facts and figures are important, but they're not always enough to inspire action.
You're right. We need to tap into people's values, their hopes, and their fears. We need to show them how climate change is not just some abstract concept, but something that's already impacting their lives and the lives of those they care about.
It's about making it personal and relatable.
Exactly. And I think we also need to celebrate the solutions and highlight the incredible work that's already happening around the world. There are so many inspiring stories of individuals, communities, and businesses taking action and making a difference. Sharing those stories can give people hope and show them that change is possible.
It's about showing that we're not alone in this and that there are already pathways to a more sustainable future.
Precisely. And ultimately, it's about empowering people to become agents of change in their own communities. When people feel informed, inspired, and empowered, they can achieve amazing things.
Welcome back to the Deep Dive. We're picking up right where we left off in our exploration of the SBTi FLAG guidance and the MRV research report.
You know, these documents are really packed with insights, and it's been fascinating to unpack them with you.
Yeah, I agree. We've talked a lot about the theory and the principles behind these initiatives, but now I'm eager to get into the nitty-gritty of how they're playing out in the real world. What are some examples of companies that are putting these ideas into practice, and what lessons can we learn from their experiences?
That's a great question. One company that's been making headlines for their innovative approach to FLAG is this global food and beverage giant. And they've committed to sourcing 100% of their key agricultural ingredients. Things like soy, palm oil, and paper deforestation free by 2025.
Wow, that's ambitious. How are they going about achieving that?
They're using a multi-pronged approach. So they're working directly with their suppliers to implement sustainable farming practices, they're investing in reforestation projects, and they're even exploring innovative technologies like blockchain to track their supply chains and ensure transparency.
It sounds like they're really taking a holistic view, addressing multiple aspects of the problem.
They are, yeah. And they're not just focused on their own operations, they're also collaborating with industry partners, NGOs, and governments to drive systemic change. Throughout that entire supply chain. They recognize that they can't solve this problem alone.
Right.
It requires collaboration and collective action.
It's inspiring to see a company of that scale taking such a proactive and ambitious approach.
I agree. And it's not just the big players that are making strides in this area. There are also a lot of smaller, innovative companies that are leading the way with their sustainable practices.
Okay.
One example that comes to mind is a company that produces plant-based meat alternatives.
Oh yeah, I've heard of them. They've been gaining a lot of traction lately.
They have. And one of the reasons for their success is their commitment to sustainability. From the very beginning, they've incorporated sustainable practices into every aspect of their business, from sourcing ingredients to packaging their products.
So sustainability is like baked into their DNA, so to speak.
Yeah, exactly. They're not treating sustainability as like an afterthought or a PR campaign. It's core to their identity and their mission. They're sourcing their ingredients from farms that prioritize regenerative agriculture practices, they're minimizing their water and energy use, and they're even using compostable packaging.
It sounds like they're walking the walk in every aspect of their business.
They are, and they're proving that sustainability and profitability can go hand in hand. Consumers are increasingly demanding sustainable products, and companies like this are showing that it's possible to meet that demand while also building a successful and thriving business.
Yeah, I think that's a crucial message. It's not about choosing between profit and sustainability. It's about finding ways to create value for both the planet and the bottom line.
Precisely. And these are just a couple of examples. There are countless other companies out there that are making incredible strides in this area, innovating, collaborating, and pushing the boundaries of what's possible.
Yeah, it's really encouraging to see so much progress happening, even in the face of these complex challenges.
I agree. It gives me hope that we can turn things around and create a more sustainable future.
Now, as we wrap up this deep dive, I want to bring it back to our listeners one last time. We've covered a lot of ground today, from the technical details of the SBTi FLAG guidance to those inspiring stories of companies making a real difference. What are some key takeaways that you hope our listeners will walk away with?
That's a great question. First and foremost, I hope listeners will come away with a deeper understanding of the crucial role that land use plays in climate change. It's an issue that often gets overshadowed by those discussions of energy and transportation, but it's absolutely essential that we address it if we're going to create a sustainable future.
It's a piece of the puzzle that we can't afford to ignore.
Exactly. And I also hope listeners will come away with a sense of empowerment. We've talked about the many ways that individuals, businesses, and governments can take action. And I want people to feel inspired and motivated to do their part, whether it's making more sustainable choices as consumers, advocating for stronger policies, or supporting businesses that are leading the way. Every action counts.
Yeah, it's about recognizing that we all have a role to play, no matter how big or small.
Exactly. And finally, I hope listeners will come away with a sense of hope and optimism. Yes, the challenges are immense, but so are the opportunities. We have the knowledge, the tools, and the collective will to create a more sustainable and just future. It's not going to be easy, but it's absolutely possible. And it's a future worth fighting for.
Well said. I could agree more. It's been an incredible journey exploring these topics with you, and I'm so grateful for your time and your insights.
The pleasure was all mine.
And to our listeners, thank you for joining us on this deep dive into the world of science-based targets and sustainable land use. Remember, knowledge is power, and we hope this episode has equipped you with the information and inspiration you need to make a difference in your own corner of the world.
Until next time, keep learning, keep questioning, and keep pushing for a better world.
And that wraps up this episode of The Deep Dive. Be sure to subscribe to our show for more in-depth explorations of the topics that matter most. We'll see you next time.